All right, my name is Antonio Reid. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of Environmental Coffee House. Today, we're going to talk about the fourth National Climate Assessment that was released, interestingly enough, on the day after Thanksgiving. First, I just want to introduce myself, give you some background on who I am. Like I said, my name is Antonio Reid. I recently graduated from Appalachian State University. The university began high-level climate talks immediately after the IPCC released its special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. The school's moving to reach climate neutrality or net neutrality by 2025, 2030. I happen to be one of the negotiators at the talk, coming up with plans on how the school can do that to be a national, international model of how universities might lead us in the future when it comes to climate neutrality and doing good things and good works for our natural ecology. Now I'm going to pass it to Nick Humphrey to tell us a little bit about who he is and what he hopes to aim to do tonight.
Hi, my name is Nick Humphrey. I'm a meteorologist based in Lincoln, Nebraska. I run a blog on a Patreon under meteorologist Nick Humphrey, discussing extreme weather events and abrupt climate change. I also run a Facebook page under meteorologist Nick Humphrey, and my primary goals have been to communicate information to the general public on issues in climate change, extreme weather events, and be able to let people know the realities of what we're facing in the future and how we can face those realities. So that's where I come from. I graduated from Mississippi State University with a master's in geosciences, applied meteorology in 2016, and I've been here in Lincoln in the Great Plains since 2008, and I'm originally from Seattle, Washington.
Okay, so Nick, let's just get right into it about the recent climate assessment that was released by the United States government. 13 agencies were included in the release of the document. What's really interesting, and I want to frame the context for this, because we're living in this world where we have a president who denies that climate change is happening, or saying that it can't be attributed to human activities. And this is now the fourth assessment. This is not the first assessment that the U.S. government has released. The last assessment was released, had to do so leaked to the New York Times. So I do want to just provide that context for our viewers, that it's not simply that mankind faces the greatest challenge we've ever faced in terms of climate, and we'll pick that apart with the new assessment. But we face this challenge, and we have our president going in the opposite direction, stepping outside of the scientific consensus on climate change. So can you just respond a little bit to the context before we actually get into the work itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough for the scientific community to try to put all the pieces together in terms of the danger of climate change, but then to have an entire sector of government, politicians that are essentially working against you is extremely unfortunate and frankly dangerous on the other end. I mean, I remember this morning, actually, a lot of the Sunday talk shows had tons of politicians. Most of them, obviously, it's not any secret. Most of the Republican Party politicians subscribe that climate change is not real and is part of a natural cycle. And you also had lobbyists, spokespeople for big business and oil companies on there as well on CBS and ABC this morning. So even as things progress and get much worse faster, there's still a concerted, essentially a propaganda effort to confuse the public, and it makes the job of the scientists and the science that they're trying to produce and to the general public that much harder to communicate.
It creates a level of scientific reticence. But before we transition, I don't want the media to get off the hook here. We have a situation where the vast majority of climatologists in the United States, Europe, Japan, China, Russia, in the industrialized world, acknowledge that this current episode of climate change has been induced by our own civilization's emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Yes. And MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, CBS, all put on the opposite side. They give way too much attention and focus onto the opposite view, that science is wrong, that there is no international consensus, and that it's okay to continue to burn prodigious amounts of fossil fuels. What has happened to the media that they would give essentially, like it would be the equivalent on the race issue, giving the microphone to the KKK? Why is it that the media continues to give a microphone, a platform, and a stage to voices that openly reject the scientific consensus?
I think we need a break. We lost Nicholas.
Oh, okay.
Back.
Okay.
Hang on. But in the meantime, keep going, Antonio. I have to get him back.
Well, Nick, I still just want to flesh out this point that we're in a situation right now where the world scientists have come together, and this is actually since before the American assessments on climate change, but even dating back to the 1990s to 1980s, there was a strong consensus coming out that climate change was human-induced and that the world would eventually see temperatures that we haven't seen since the pre-industrial era.
He's back.
So Nick, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so Nick, can you just comment on that expression I was making earlier about how our media gives so much attention and focus to people, really a hyper minority of people who reject the international scientific consensus on climate change?
Yeah, I think the media, they've always felt that their job is to give both sides of a story in most cases. But I think the problem is that that small minority that continue to be some of the loudest people in terms of denying that climate change is, anthropogenic, meaning it's caused by humans, have been given a voice by people that are well known, by politicians, by some economists, by a lot of people that they feel that they have to pay attention to, and so the media feels they have to give them the attention. And unfortunately, I've seen very few media agencies, big ones, really say we're not going to give that any credence. I think several months ago, The Guardian in the UK had an editorial where they basically said that they're no longer going to give any serious credibility to the climate denial side of things because there's so much evidence right in everybody's faces that is simply not correct. The data itself demonstrates that that climate change is caused by humans. So it's not caused by the sun and solar output and volcanoes. It's caused by humanity's burning of fossil fuels, and now increasingly the changes that the Earth is producing to accelerate that. So there's really no credibility behind them. But unfortunately, the media, particularly in the United States, I don't know if it's a corporate thing, because maybe the biggest corporations also have a lot of connections in the economy and the market and finances with the oil companies. I don't know what it is, or if it's a political thing, but they want the other side, if you will, to always get a voice, even though there's the support in the data is heavily against them.
So let's get into more of the substance of what the report has to say about the state of climate. And really it is a report that is, half of it really is just about observational data, what the scientists see, what the agencies are reporting. Donald Wobbles, Dr. Donald Wobbles is the professor of atmospheric sciences at Illinois State University. He's the lead author on this project. The reason why I bring that up is he's a modeler, and I think the type of science that's produced by the report is fairly conservative, given what's been happening and what other scientists have been saying. I think the max temperature they see by the end of this century is 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise. They come up with, I think, a very incredible conclusion. We can kind of work back into the report, but from this point, that we would expect to see 10% decline of the U.S. economy by 2100. To me, that sounds incredibly conservative, and almost to the point where it might pacify or come off as pacifying the population and doling a response. Can you say something to what that really means?
Yeah. So I looked over the report, and well, for one thing, a lot of their numbers are based on what will happen from now. Not relative to pre-industrial, so which would be the 1700s. So they acknowledge that there is a possibility that the temperature of the planet could anomaly exceed 5 degrees Celsius, or about 7 degrees Fahrenheit anomaly by the end of the century. But that's relative to what it is at now. So that would be exceeding 6 degrees relative to pre-industrial. The models, they do not account for many of the feedbacks that are occurring in the climate system that are known to occur but are difficult to quantify. And there's positive feedbacks and negative feedbacks. Positive feedback is something that essentially drives something to go faster and faster and faster, and it feeds on itself. Negative feedback is the opposite. And a lot of those processes have started to occur relatively recently, literally in the past decade or two. The increases in permafrost melt, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. That's literally something that's begun, really in the past decade and a half. The increasing releases of methane from subsea permafrost that's melting because of increasingly warm waters in the eastern Siberian Arctic and other areas of the Arctic. That's a process that's really started in the past decade and a half. The opening up of what sometimes is referred to as the Northwest Passage, the once folktale passage to get across the Arctic as quickly as possible, which involves very open, wide waters and little sea ice along the coast of Canada and Alaska and Russia. That's started to become ice free during the summer in just the past decade and a half, because of a rapid collapse of the Arctic sea ice sheet. The ocean circulations are weakening. The jet stream circulation. There's been research showing it's rapidly becoming much more wavier, much higher in amplitude waves, producing extreme heat events, but also extreme cold events at the expense of the cold in the Arctic, which is warming rapidly, causing it to become wavier. That's a process that's really picked up steam in the past decade to decade and a half. When I look at the modeling in the IPCC and what obviously they use in the national assessments, which is based on that, the only scenario that I think is in any way reasonable is what they call representative concentration pathway 8.5, and basically it's business as usual, where you're increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere rapidly through the century, and that would bring the planet to be 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer than there was in the 1700s by 2100. And that's the only one I can take seriously in any sort of way. And it's extremely conservative because it doesn't include all of these other things that can make the process go either a little bit faster or a lot faster. And that's the scary thing. We don't know how much faster it's going to go, but it seems fairly certain that's going to go faster than that model suggests. And all the other ones, they base themselves on being able to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and we don't have the technology to do that on the scale that's required. And we can go into it more if you want, but there are reasons for that.
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about or kind of bring into this conversation about climate change and how government agencies in the United States are approaching it is that in 2007, the Age of Consequences was released jointly by Pentagon staff, people like John Podesta, the former advisor to Bill Clinton, transition chief, Obama White House, Hillary Clinton campaign manager, 2016. So he's the lead author on this project in 2007, The Age of Consequences. And they point out 3 scenarios. And again, I like to keep on bringing up, this was in 2007, the same year the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had won the Nobel Prize for its projections on temperature rise to 2100. The 2007 assessment that was released pointed out 3 scenarios: expected, severe, and catastrophic. The expected scenario was 1.3 degrees Celsius above 1990 baseline by 2040. Severe was 2.6 degrees Celsius above the 1990 baseline by 2040. Catastrophic was 5.6 degrees Celsius above the baseline by 2100. Okay, so it seems odd to me that we would get these type of climate assessments year after, or not year after year, but they're spaced out. But we get the climate assessment like the recent one just that came out on Friday. That to me are understating the case still based on the data that our government agencies had. I mean, this was coming from the Center of International Strategic Affairs, but this data was compiled by essentially data that was in the U.S. government agencies at the time being shared with the Pentagon. So how is it that we're still so much further than what we were in 2007? Can you talk about the complacency there, or the reticence, or?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, I think with the government and the Pentagon, they're concerned about the survival of the of the country, and specifically their ability to defend it. So a lot of times you may find I suspect the assessments from them may be more somewhat more realistic, simply because their interests are what's going to happen to our assets, our ability to defend, fight wars, how many more wars there may be because of climate change, and countries getting desperate, and perhaps our nation getting desperate to go take over resources that are dwindling. With the IPCC and maybe the larger public assessments that get so much attention, I think and even in the assessment, there's a lot more discussion about the economy and how the economy will fare, and that seem very conservative.
Yeah, 10% reduction,
unrealistic at worst, and I think that may be a result of basically trying to not scare people. Scare people that the general public that are a part of the economic system and economic paradigm. And this isn't necessarily a hit on capitalism per se. There's a lot of economic systems where they involve the destruction of the environment to grow, and unfortunately, to admit that that could turn against us and end up destroying our very ability to grow further because we've grown too much and destroyed too much around us. That's not really something that can be fully admitted, because the IPCC's purpose is to provide, a comprehensive scientific, evidence of what's happened to the climate so far and what they believe can happen in the future, so governments can do something to mitigate or adapt against it. Even in their very conservative assessment, that's what they do. And so saying that there could be such catastrophic impacts that the economy could basically fail, and we may not be able to have economic growth as we know it anymore. Even that, a lot of people could be displaced, die. That's not really something that, I mean, it's just say it the way it is. It's not something they want to advertise out fully, and it's just not advertised. I mean, Professor, Kevin Anderson in the UK, he's been very prominent in discussions of how the IPC does things in his participation in the process. Stated that basically 4C may not be viable for an organized, community, human community on this planet, meaning civilization would collapse, because how are you going to feed 7 or 9 billion people? How are you going to provide enough water for 7 or 9 billion people? Already a couple billion people on this earth have trouble getting food, but I mean, that risk of going to 4C, 5C, that's in these existing reports, but nobody talks about what the implications of them are, because the implications are that the world as we know it right now, forget the possibility of like a mass extinction event or all that other stuff, just the world as we know it ends. It ends. There's no way it can continue. It's going to end, so.
Well, what I think is kind of interesting about this whole conversation is that, because I think there's a point to be understood here as well, right? So in 2007, IPCC says 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. You got the age of consequences saying upward of 5 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. You got the current climate assessment report saying anywhere between 3 and 5. But I think what people are missing out of this conversation is the paleoclimatological angle here. I mean, you're really talking about a temperature rise that hasn't been experienced on Earth for tens of millions of years. And, yes. you're talking about rushing there. A decade, a century, that's almost irrelevant to ask that for the species on the planet. The question, are we going to hit 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 within 100 years, or within 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years, or 70, or 80 is I think that part of the discussion is also kind of absent here. And I don't think, why is it absent from the conversation? Is it because it's part of that scare factor? Or is it because there's a conservative bias by people who are modelers, and they just can't put together how that type of climatic change affects the biosphere?
Yeah, I think there's a difficulty in perhaps mentally just quantifying just how extreme that is. I've had discussions with people about not just the total change in temperature, but also the rate of change. I know there was a study done about, I think it was in 2004, and it said that right now, and by the way, right now, up to this point, at least up until recent years, we've been going up about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. And it was stated in 2004 that if we start going up 0.3%, 0.3 C per decade, that 15% of ecosystems on Earth will not be able to adapt. So, an ecosystem is a collection of different species that are interacting with each other, with some sort of balance. And those within a given environment, if you get that massive environmental change, some species fail, others perhaps temporarily at least blossom, and you get imbalances, the ecosystems collapse. A really famous idea of this is the coral reefs. The coral reefs are dying from these massive bleaching events. If the coral reefs and coral, especially shallow water coral, if they go extinct, then you end up having a disastrous impact going up the food chain, which includes humans. And they also stated that if we start going up 0.4 C per decade, then literally all ecosystems known on Earth would likely face collapse or be destroyed. And with, some more opportunistic species dominating and others going extinct. So when you look at the changes that have occurred over the past 10,000 years, or what we call the Holocene, and then before that, through the end of the Ice Age, our rate of change in temperature so far is been nearly 200 times faster than it was during the Holocene, where most of that earlier part of the period, like 3,000 years ago, we were mostly steady, and then for about 4,000 or 5,000 years, we've been going back to a gradual global cooling over a course of 5,000 years up until the pre-industrial period, when we started going to industrialization. And even during the end of the Ice Age, when we were 4 C colder than pre-industrial roughly, and rose up rapidly, was over maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years, not, and a lot of it was actually drawn out over about 10,000 or 11,000 years, but there was a period where it was fastest over a course of like 2,000 or 3,000 years, going up about 0.5 degree Celsius. But here we're talking about going up, 6 degrees in, a span of like 100 years, 115 years. It's the pace, the ability to adapt, whether it's humans, whether it's other species on the planet, the ability to adapt is a function of the rate of change in the system. The faster the rate of change is, the lower the ability to adapt. So it's, sort of inversely proportional, but it may be even worse than that, because we would consider, by human standpoint, small changes become absolutely catastrophic the more in magnitude they go and the faster the rate that they move. So, what that means for us is that it means that, you were trying to think, oh, I've heard all sorts of ideas, like trying to genetically engineer crops to deal with more heat, or trying to build seawalls, and our human ability to adapt to things is based on literally thousands of years to be able to deal with small changes. When those changes are catastrophically fast, then we're just lost, because we can't outthink speed. And I don't know if people are really grasping that. Mostly, the reason they can't grasp it is because nobody's really reminding people that how horrible those rates of change really are to everything that they depend on. Everything that they depend on, every crop that we have, every building that we build to deal with the weather, everything depends on stability. And if we can't ever be more than 2 or 3 steps behind the rate of change, then we face the catastrophic or existential threat that's a lot worse than people realize.
So when the IPCC warns, and I think there's a really good context. So when the IPCC warns about catastrophe 2030, what is that real? Is that what you're talking about? Is we're at a period of essentially falling behind the rate of change, that we can't keep up anymore as a civilization to the changes that are occurring that have been induced by our climate?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other way to put it. We're falling significantly behind. To have done the kind of things that we need to do to stave off this catastrophe would have been challenging. I mean, minus the technological issues, is because technology was very different back in the day than it is in 2018. But minus even that, say we could have come up with all these sorts of these technological innovations, it would have been very challenging to accomplish in the 1950s, 1960s. with the number of people on the planet, the amount of carbon that had been released into the atmosphere in 1955, 1960, the challenges of trying to stabilize, get off fossil fuels. That it would have been, maybe challenging is a poor word. It would have been Herculean in 1960 in the Kennedy era to do what we're trying to accomplish. Because people just don't really understand. Like, in order to, and I've been really trying to hammer this with people lately. Like they talk about we have 12 years to get off, to get 50% of emissions from 2010. It's not really we have 12 years. We have to start literally doing it right now and declining all the way to 2030.
Yeah.
But what people don't really understand is that in order to get off of business as usual, you have to use business as usual. You have to, how are you going to build the global renewable infrastructure? How are you going to build the carbon capture and storage technology to scale that has to remove tens of billions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere every single year, while hopefully humans are somehow trying to reduce consumption and not put so much in the atmosphere every single year at the same time? How do you allocate for a lot of parts of the world? Soil is depleted as well. So how do you allocate the 1 to 2 India's worth of land that you need to burn, burn plant matter that takes in CO2 as it grows, and then store all of that? How do you get the water that's required to grow all of those plants, which then, water that is equivalent to most of the water that we use on Earth for agriculture today? That would have been a Herculean task to do in 1960. Would have required U.S., USSR, all these other countries all trying to come together to deal with this threat that was far bigger than their desire to shoot nukes at each other. That would have been a Herculean task. Today, the speed that is already set on climate change in terms of to what's already been done, in terms of what's irreversible and has to come to fruition by thermodynamic principles. It's like you're like, I'm the sloth and the road runner is 6 miles away. How do I catch up to that? That's what a lot of people don't get. We can make attempts to try to adapt deep. I know some have discussed the idea of deep adaptation. You can try to do things to try to rein in the damage is already done, try to limit the damage or make the damage go more slowly for things that we can't stop. But that's why I've said the literal idea of stopping climate change, in terms of like the warming temperatures and the impacts, large scale impacts, that's impossible. Not because it maybe not could have been done at some point, but because we've fallen so far behind. It's not we have until 2030. Is that we had the 1950s, the 1960s. We really started ballooning our fossil fuels to do something about it. It's not just China's fault or India's fault. It's the United States' fault. It's Europe's fault. Everybody has a part to play in what's happening, and we had a part to play in fixing it. But we've gone so far behind now. It's very difficult to see how we can turn the ship around completely 180 degrees.
Well, I get the sense though. I get the sense that the elites don't want to turn this around, or maybe they've given up, or they see that as a failed endeavor. Because, like I say, you get these other assessments that come out that are a lot less private, to kind of go under the mainstream, that are talking about much more serious cases of abrupt climate change than what we get on the national assessment.
Yeah.
So my understanding of this is that, well, first of all, we have to understand that the United States Pentagon is the one agency, is the most concerned agency about climate change than NASA or NOAA or any other agency, interestingly enough. So given the fact that
to defend the country,
well, to defend the country, but I don't think just to. There's a saying that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it eventually imposed on itself.
Yeah.
So these assessments, kind of come to continue to put together. This is what we expect to happen. Well, I was talking to one author, and I won't say his name. But he actually is co-author to IPCC, co-author to U.S. climate assessment as well. And one thing he said this very cynically: if you want to understand how the U.S. government is preparing for climate catastrophe in the next decade or the next 2 decades or 3, is look at what they're saying about 2100. That's really what they're talking about in the period between 2030, 2050. So to me, I see this as a situation where the military is going to prepare to respond to what will have to be, as you talk about, as we start to see ecology around us come down. We'll see impacts with food. We'll see impacts with energy. We'll see impacts of water. We'll see a refugee crisis, and the likes of which we've never seen before. I mean, look at what's happening in the border already. I mean, we can't say it's 100% climate change related, but it certainly is.
Europe.
Well, in Europe is much worse. The crisis in Europe is worse than it was in the Second World War already. But just looking at our own border as a sneak preview into the future. But essentially, the tropics, they're warming much slower, obviously, than the Arctics or even the mid-latitudes, but they are warming. But the thing about the tropics is that a little warmth goes a long way.
Yeah.
So we're talking about reaching almost a permanent state of wet bulb temperature in the tropics. We're talking about reaching a temperature which the crops are going to fail permanently. We're really talking about emptying out the tropics. And that doesn't take a 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature to do that. I mean, you hit that threshold much sooner and earlier on. And we're talking about possible 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius between 2030, 2050. We're going to start seeing a lot of these impacts very soon here, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I think I think it's pretty likely. Well, in terms of pre-industrial temperature, there is and the reason I'm mentioning this will be obvious in a second, but there was a study, I believe it was in 2016 or 17, that determined that the pre-industrial temperature is about the anomaly was about up to 0.8 C cooler than 1986 to 2005. So when you calculate it that way, we may have reached 1.4 in 2016 during the height and decline of the El Nino, and then we've gone down a couple tenths of a degree since. But now we'll rise again somewhat with this new El Nino that's starting to come up. A case where essentially short-term variability makes global warming a little bit worse. So I think it is highly probable that in the next decade, barring something much more serious that could make global warming much worse, just based on the trends, we're going to probably see at least 1 year of 1.5 Celsius relative to pre-industrial, and in the next 5 to 10 years, and obviously global warming continues, it exacerbates, accelerates further. So we'll see more of those years as we continue on into the 2030s. When you start getting to 1.5, 2 C, especially at the rates that we've discussed, you start seeing near 100% mortality for coral reefs. You start seeing temperatures, heat waves that become much more extreme across the world. the hottest temperatures that any particular climate regime will experience in a 2C world, 4 degrees Celsius warmer than they were in an earlier climate era. 4C is around 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So if your climate area gets 102, 105, you'd be looking at a lot more extreme temperatures, closer to 110 for your highest, warmest high temperatures. And then the nighttime temperatures go up even higher than that. So especially at night in subtropical and tropical regions, not only do you deal with the blasting heat, summertime heat, but you can't cool off at night. And I've already started to notice, in our one really perhaps truly subtropical part of the contiguous United States, South Florida, Miami, Key West in particular, they're getting a lot this year. Last year, they've been getting a lot more record, not only record highs, but record high minimums, where you're getting the highest daily minimum temperatures on record. In California this year, I can't remember what month it was, but there was a month in the summer when they had the highest average minimum temperature records set in a lot of cities there. So, I mean, it's the ability for humans just biologically to deal with challenges from climate change are extreme in and of themselves. When you talk about the species that we need to also survive, insect populations are collapsing for our plants, and of course the ability for crops to reproduce and sustain themselves. That's also a threat when you start getting these consistent temperatures. At 4 degrees Celsius above 4.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels globally, you're talking 8 Celsius or higher in the central and northern plains. And I'm in the corn husker state. There ain't going to be corn growing here very well once you start going above 1.52C, and by 4C, this is a desert.
So let me focus on a little bit on that. So, when you say going above 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, are you talking about the regional level, or are you talking about at the global level?
In that case, I'm talking about the global level, but typically over land areas, just because land masses warm faster than the globe as a whole, because much of the globe is ocean, it can be 2 to 3 times hotter over land areas than it is over on the globe as a whole, average between the land and sea surface. So if you're looking at, for example, right now the average global temperature of the Earth's land areas, northern and southern hemisphere, is knocking on the door of 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial, even though it's hanging around 1.2, 1.4 globally. So we're feeling that rise in our air temperatures on land more than the oceans. Of course, in the oceans, the life in the oceans is much more sensitive, is very sensitive to these temperature rises because they're constantly exposed to the ocean. They're exposed, everything from the reproduction, everything depends on stability that the oceans provide. They're heat sinks. It takes a lot more heat to warm water than it does the same amount of volume of air or soil. So rises have been slower in the ocean, but they're killing off species, reducing populations and killing off species, or killing off keystone species like coral. So you look at the land areas, however, for us here on the land, we're feeling that global warming harder than the global average suggests, simply because of the fact that land areas heat much faster, and so the air over them heats much faster, and so that means the droughts, the fires, all those things, more evaporation leading to aridification. Those things increase faster than they might have otherwise.
Let me ask you maybe something that's a little bit more personal as we grapple with this, because I think, this is a moment that our species, that individuals are all in, that we're facing. In my own view, I think before the horrors are truly unleashed by a collapsed ecology, global ecology, a out of control climate change, our own human systems will fail before that, much before that. They'll fail earlier on. And that itself will lead to a type of horror and chaos. World War II could be a reference, but not really, because this would be much beyond that.
Yeah.
Do you have children, and how do you prepare that? How do you respond to that feeling that must be invoked by this intellectual knowing of what we are stepping into?
I do have a son. He's 2 years old right now. I obviously I knew about climate change, and I was just starting to learn about the full implications of it beyond what most people in the general public hear in just the past couple of years. For me, there's a lot of there's some anger, there's some frustration that we as a global society didn't really take this seriously early enough. Early enough, decades before I was even born. I'm 34. I've watched, my home, like I said, I'm from Seattle. I've watched the Pacific Northwest go from when I was born in the mid 80s, in the early 90s, this, place where it could be relatively wet. Even in the summertime, it would be wet, morning clouds, cool. It's hot a few times. Do this dry, aridifying place that has all these fires. And I look on Facebook, and I'm seeing Seattle surrounded by ridiculous amounts of smoke 2 years in a row now. I think it's been 2 or 3 years in a row. The smog and smoke in Seattle during these fires, and I sit here and I understand what's happening, and it causes me sort of anguish and disappointment, and and trying to how do I plan for the future when I'm not sure what the future is going to look like. It also causes me some grief. I remember actually just yesterday, me and my fiance and my son, we went to the zoo in Omaha, Nebraska. It has one of the top 10 zoos in the country. It also has an aquarium, huge aquarium. And I was looking at my 2-year-old running around in the aquarium, looking at all the fish and the jellyfish and everything else, and I was thinking, there's a possibility that in 50 or 100 years, all of these things that look so beautiful, all this diversity that is known to me, may be dead or not exist, may be extinct, because we've caused so much dramatic change. And I just, I stood there and I just wasn't really sure how to process that. I see all these beautiful sharks and sea turtles, and
But I think at some level, and I don't mean to press you, but I think at some level, and I, it's so interesting if you're talking, because I felt and I feel a lot of those same type of anxieties and emotions. I came home to middle North Carolina. I spent the last 5 years in Boone, North Carolina, in the mountains, which has a very different ecology and climate than, of course, the Piedmont region. But when I came home, it was different. I could tell that it had been changed. I mean, essentially, our summer had come a month, and this happened at least in the last since I've come back. Our summer had appeared to started a month earlier and ended a month later. Is truly incredible. And I could tell that all the insects, I've seen spiders, I've seen wasps, I've seen bees, at times of the years that I ought not be seeing them, fireflies. I can tell that the ecology where I live is in a state of shock. But in understanding that and feeling that emotional, I don't know how really to describe it, but I have to realize that if these things go, and they will go, that means so too do we. It's not going to be, it's not going to be humans, as we are standing here 100 years from now, looking back and saying, "Oh, isn't that sad that all these things, when I was a child, are now gone?" Because so too would we. Because at the rate that these things are disappearing, you were mentioning the insects earlier. I remember, and I'm 25. I remember there was a time where you would drive down the street and the front of your car would be filled with bugs and insects.
Yeah.
That was in my living time.
Yeah.
And now that's not true. I can drive. I did a drive actually up to Sandy's house in August, all the way up from North Carolina to Angelica, New York. And it looked like maybe I just drove to Walmart for 20 minutes or something. It was incredible.
Yeah. 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 It's I think something a lot of people don't want to admit. I've had to sort of come to terms with it myself. But we human beings, we become so accustomed to determining our own destiny. Through what we build, what we collect, what we create from as far as our medicines, what we do with. We can do anything. We can go to the moon. We can send, ships to the solar system.
Low battery.
And it becomes like an issue where you don't really realize that the world that you've depended on, is going to throw the carpet from under you, and you can't survive. There's no amount of human ingenuity that you can come up with to get out of the fact that that you can't survive, and I think for humans, I think it's it's sort of it's as individuals, we all face we all or will all face the the process of decline and death at some point in the future. It doesn't matter. That's the way it's always been, because what lives must die. But it's one thing to talk about that. It's another thing, I think, even to admit that we as a species are not gods. We're not infinite. We can go just as much as anybody else, in our ability to outthink the planet and the laws of physics and thermodynamics and all these things. That's not possible. We fit within that framework. We are a part of the universe. We are a part of nature. And if there is an imbalance, it must be corrected. And if that includes our demise, as part of a mass extinction, then that's the way it's going to be. And so when we depend on, especially as a large species like mammals, like mammalian species, we depend on a certain range of temperatures, all these insects to help pollinate our food, other creatures that we may eat for meat, all throughout the world, fish. When you depend on all of those things, and all of those things are going away or declining, and we've grown to such a huge degree, both in terms of numbers and our consumption based on what was available to us in the past thousands of years, there is no other direction but down. And there's no way to with 100% certainty to say that we'll go extinct on the planet, but there is 100% certainty that our ability to be extant or extinct depends on on the ability of other species to deal with the same climate change and the same ecological damage that we as humans have produced, to survive. And so, that's basically the way it is. We are not exempt from nature, and so nature, if it changes because in response to what we've done and what continues to be done to the planet, we may not be able to fit into that framework. I just saw someone say that they don't accept extinction. I don't accept it either, but there are, realities that we have to face based on our biological limitations. And, so it's just the way it is.
Well, so one thing I want to do is I want to respond to that point as well about accepting extinction. But before I do that, I also want to now open up the comment section for questions to me or Nick or both of us as well. But this whole idea about accepting extinction, I'm 25 years old. I don't want any of this to be happening. And the same person, I was reading your comments, I think they're interesting, said that it was her generation. So my mom and my grandparents, it was their generation to responsibility to reduce carbon emissions. And it would be my generation then responsibility to sequester carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Firstly, I don't think for us, for people like you and me, when these systems start coming down around us, I can't say if the human species is going to go extinct this century.
Yeah.
But in one sense, as we go down the century, we will get at a point where it appears for us that things are just headed catastrophically downhill.
Yeah.
I accept that in my life. I accept now that the Great Expansion is over, that the post-war living arrangement is now over, that these things cannot, we reached peak. We reached peak economy. We reached peak consumption. Those things are now on a decline. And so I can't expect to, this idea, there's iPhone 10 now, right? Is there going to be an iPhone 100 now? And I accept that. And I accept that this will probably overtake my life. I understand that. But when you realize what you said earlier is that we are going to die anyways, recognizing this doesn't do anything, but it puts the existential crisis back in our life that had always been there. And that gives us, I think, an opportunity to live with some dignity. That now we can do things understanding that no, we were not gods, no, we were not going to live forever, but now we can do things with a sense of urgency, with a sense of love, with a sense of care, while accepting that we still are looking at oblivion. I mean, in Christological language, they say that you cannot save yourself, your works cannot save you. Now true is that for us in the secular world, but we can still perform good works and do good things for the planet, for other earthlings, and for the people we love.
Yeah. On the someone commenter brought up the issue of fatalism. This isn't fatalism. Fatalism to me is basically you just give up, surrender, and that's the end of it. Admitting that there's a possibility, maybe even a likelihood. It's hard, that that there could be an ending to the human story. That's just, that's just reality, like it is. If there were most of the species on the planet, like 95% of the species have gone extinct, no matter how long they've been on the Earth. But saying, at the same time, as you say, we're still here, and there are things that we could be doing, to be compassionate to each other and to the planet. And we're not even doing, and most of at least the governments of the world that supposedly represent us aren't largely doing those things. I mean, I've spoken about, why are we still building more and more, houses and hotels and everything else right along the coast when we know that those areas are just not going to exist in maybe even in 30 years because of sea level rise. Why don't we know the storms are going to get more powerful? They're going to get more violent. You're going to see a lot more Hurricane Michaels, Hurricane Harveys, and all of this. Why not, set land use practices, reforest or those areas or whatever was there in terms of flora, fauna before humans took over those areas, and retreat from those areas so that they at least can flood without humans being there to die. Why not come up with global policy for dealing with transporting transport of goods and other services and other trade practices to try to limit carbon emissions in the atmosphere? Even if we can't do this, like drop it in 12 years stuff, I mean, that it seems pretty comical, but you can still do a lot of things to limit CO2 emissions. And why don't we come up with ways to reduce food waste and water waste when we know both of those are going to become limited severely because of climate change? Why not promote in a lot of countries that are, frankly, very conservative, either religiously or for other reasons? They don't allow their the females of their population to be able to control their own ability to have children. And I'm not one of these people that bashes third world countries for having lots of babies. That because a lot of it is the lack of control that women have over their own reproduction in those countries. And so there are a lot of things. Again, migration, actually, migration of people, from the tropics. Why not do things to control that? To help people that move up here have the ability to be fed and be clothed and be treated with respect. So it's a matter of a compassion for people and compassion for the biosphere. And if we're not doing that, then I don't know what else we can do to help our people on this planet.
Hey everybody, Antonio will be back in a second.
Okay.
He just had a computer fail, so
okay.
Welcome. Hi everyone. This is going very well. Well, it has been an hour and a couple of minutes, so he had a little bit of a fail. But if I was gonna say, it's been a very interesting conversation,
yeah,
to say the least. There's so much more to talk about. People want to talk about the report, talking about how we're going to at least adapt for the coming years. We're all alive.
Yeah.
We're all here. We all have to live somewhere until we don't. So, there's what's her name? I've been following Karen, Jeffers Tracy. Welcome. It was really nice to read your comments. there's people are not going to give up. Nobody's going to give up. They're going to fight, but we have to get the knowledge out so they can. Okay, he's back, so you don't have to listen to me.
It's always good to listen to you.
No, but tonight is not me. Are you back, Antonio?
Okay.
All right.
I can hear everybody, so that's good.
Well, you're going to wrap it up. I'm going back off. You guys will tell me what you're doing to wrap it up, and goodbye.
All righty. I'm not sure if you heard my answer to your question, essentially about adaptation.
I was hearing a little bit about the situations or adaptation to my question. Asking this question about why do we continue to, I don't know, comically build on places that we know are going to be devastated, like the coast. Oh, and one of my questions or concerns is Puerto Rico got devastated.
Yeah.
Absolutely devastated. They're going to be devastated again before they're able to. And I don't mean to wish bad on them, but given the science, given where they are, geographically, they're going to be devastated again. So what do we? But what do you do? Do you tell people that we have to abandon the coastlines? Do you tell people they're going to have to give up their lives, their homes, doing a retreat inland? I think at some point you do.
Yeah.
Because
we basically, if again, throwing, regardless of what, how humanity as a species ultimately does in the coming decades and, and whatnot and centuries or whatever, at the end of the day, we're entering a period of time where, as you say, we're essentially hitting, limits to growth. That's basically what it is. And our ability to have, all these things. And I mean, obviously it's been more so in some countries than others, and other countries are trying to catch up to get all the stuff and material and consumption that Europe has had, US has had for many decades. But at the end of the day, we're reaching, no matter how unfair that distribution was, no matter what it is, we're reaching a point where nobody can do that anymore. And it's not like a point that where we lose the resources to conduct business as usual. Like literally the planet is going to blow back in our faces via everything it can throw at us, the storms, the sea level rise, the greater spread of health problems, from heat related health to infectious diseases. I mean, it's going to basically throw everything at us to stamp out our ability to be at the scale that we've expanded ourselves to. I mean, it's a huge scale, not in terms of the population growth, like 7.7 billion, I think, as of this month, but just the massive amount of consumption, the massive amount of pollution, from industrial pollution, microplastics in the oceans and our bodies, everything, that is more, that is, that it will come to a crashing halt now. And, the stuff they talk about, it almost sounds like something out of the apocalypse of a religious text or something, but it unfortunately is. It's the scientific realities of we're on a planet that we've treated like a battery, and that battery is running down, and so our civilization, which is an engine.
Nick.
Well, I guess we lost Nick now. Maybe that is some cosmic message that we've gone over an hour, and it's been really good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, actually, I think I really didn't want to be on with, this was your guys' thing. Yeah, it's actually an hour and 15 minutes. So
Okay.
what do you say, everybody? We wrap up.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great conversation. We had some feedback in the audience that I enjoyed kind of tackle. I wish we would have dug a little bit deeper into the actual climate assessment report, but providing that crucial context for which all this is happening is so important too. So thank you so much, Sandy Shallows, for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation and dialogue.
You're welcome. I don't know what happened to Nicholas. I wish he was coming. He was back to say goodbye. We could wait a second. Vanessa, yeah. Vanessa's here. Thank you, Vanessa, for coming. And I've been putting things up. Jeff, thanks for coming. This was good. It was really good. And we have to, you know, and oh, hi, Marcia. And Marcia says, why don't you wrap up for us, Antonio?
Okay. Well, I don't have a problem with that. Well, thank you guys again for joining us for this episode of Environmental Coffee House, talking about the United States National Climate Assessment in the context of climate change and how we as individuals, as communities, can respond to this unveiling truth in our lives. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.